looked at the sort of biophysical ways that climate impacts on crop production and livestock production, I want to turn to looking at some of the projected impacts of climate change in Africa. Now, to make these projections or estimates of how climate change might affect agriculture in Africa, we need to do two things. We need to take the outputs of climate models that suggest how the climate might change and input those into models of agricultural systems. These will typically be crop models or farm system models. And then one can see how that climate change, that changed climate, propagates through to affect both crop production or crop growth and production and yields in a particular farm. Now, compared to the rest of the world, we don't have that many results from Africa. There have just not been that many studies. And that's complicated by, as I mentioned before, the diversity in cropping systems, farming types, the different types of crops that occur across what is a very large continent. But if we do take the evidence that is available, nearly all studies show a reduction in yield as climate change progresses. And that's across many different crops. So, for instance, one study that tried to aggregate results across much of West Africa showed that for a moderate level of global warming, that's about 2 degrees of global warming, and this is among rain-fed crops, the yields decreased by a few percent to up to 20%. Now, the effect of rainfall is really important there. So temperature generally produces a reduction in yield, but that reduction was much worse in areas where rainfall had reduced as well. So the 20% reduction in yield was accompanied by locations where rainfall had decreased, and the 1 to 2% reduction in yield was where rainfall had not changed or had actually increased. When one looks at higher levels of warming, so kind of a worst case scenario, if the world doesn't get its act together to solve the climate change problem, then, so perhaps a 4-degree global warming, then there are quite scary reductions in yields from crops, somewhere between 20 and 40%. The 20% where rainfall doesn't change or increases, and as much as 40% where, in addition to the 4 degrees in warming, there's a reduction in rainfall. So the other important thing to note about these figures is that we're talking here about average yields. So that's taking year-to-year yields, say over a 20-year period, and looking at the average yield over that period. So 20% reduction or a 40% reduction. But we have to remember that there's also year-to-year variability in yields. So importantly, we know that some of the worst food security impacts come through those extreme years where you've had a particularly bad year and the yields have been very low, or you've had crop failures. And the best evidence that we have is that the variability in yields is going to increase in the future as well. So we're going to get what would be considered a bad year in the present climate will become much more frequent and common in future. And so those sort of extreme or intense food insecurity events are likely to become much more frequent if we don't adapt our farming systems. Another really interesting thing to look at is the viability of the crops that are currently grown in different parts of Africa. The studies that have been done suggest that for high levels of global warming, maybe 4 degrees or so, over much of Africa, crops that are currently grown in a particular location won't be able to be grown there anymore. So imagine you're a farmer in Botswana and you're currently growing maize. The maize that you're growing just won't be viable in the future, and you're going to have to transition to growing a different type of crop that comes from a different part of the continent, or perhaps growing a crop that hasn't even been invented yet because the climate conditions are so different to the present day. So when you're thinking about long-term adaptation, we really do need to be thinking about what crops are going to be viable to grow in different locations in this future climate. A critical issue in the African context is the current very low yields of crops. We're going to talk about this a bit more in the next part of the lecture, but the critical thing here is that if you're only producing, say, 1 or 2 tons of a certain crop per hectare, a 20% change in that yield can be a tipping point into food insecurity and famine. If you had very productive farms, then a 10 or 20% change wouldn't have such a big impact.